In an effort to explain and even predict trends in monetary economics, efforts have focused on whether or not there exists an automatic response for the balance of payments to adjust to disturbances. Traditional economists have asserted that such a tendency exists, but the type of adjustment they assumed to be in place at any time has varied with the focus on the domestic economy. The accepted classical theory explained how movements in relative prices between domestic and foreign-made commodities resulted from exchange rate migrations, and that the balance of payments automatically self-corrected. It was assumed that this process could be aided by domestic policy interventions involving interest rates, which meant that the adjustment was only partially automatic. This theory of the self-regulating character of the balance of payments was successfully formulated by economist David Hume. John Maynard Keynes introduced a revision to this philosophy, supported by the prevailing conditions of unemployment in the 1930s, to reflect a totally different causal mechanism. He asserted that if prices were constant, adjustment tended to come through variations in income and employment. The direct effects of any initial change in imports or exports on the income flow, and consequently on the balance of trade, would be strengthened by the variation in the money supply and in the rate of interest, which also would result from the initial change in the balance of trade.
When we find instances of economies being seriously knocked out of equilibrium, it's generally been as a result of government policy mistakes. But Keynes didn't really make a convincing case that even when an economy was knocked out of equilibrium, that government action could do better than allowing the economy to essentially mend itself.
So Keynes was either an economic saviour or the man who led us all astray. But there's no argument that he changed our world and the way we think about it. He was at the centre of the debate 80 years ago, and he's back there again today.
A great weight is lifted from us.
This is the only known film of Keynes speaking.
There's no danger of the exchange falling too far. There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living.
It's a broadcast about economics, how to share out the world's resources.
Meanwhile, British trade...
But for Keynes, this was no dry science. It was about changing the world for the better.
I think if we're looking at Britons who made a real difference in the 20th century, the most obvious name would be Winston Churchill. John Maynard Keynes is really not far behind.
Nations operate much like businesses, needing to maintain their balance of payments, necessitating total debts equaling their total credits. As happens, a current account deficit means an excess of imports over exports of goods, services, income flows, and unilateral transfers. The nation finances these deficits through stocks of international reserves, and the willingness of other nations to invest in or lend to the deficit nation. The adjustment mechanism is the process to re-establish equilibrium to the deficit nation or surplus nation, as the case may be. Currently, the U.S. is in a deficit nation position and will seek a return to financial equilibrium. There are two adjustment types. The first is the automatic adjustment for the current account that automatically promotes systemic equilibrium. Second, when the automatic adjustments fail to restore equilibrium in a timely manner, government interventions may be executed to compel the intended changes. The mechanism is orchestrated through government interventions to domestic incomes, commodity prices, and the cost of capital, interest rates.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. I'm taking one further step to protect the dollar, to improve our balance of payments, and to increase jobs for Americans. As a temporary measure, I am today imposing an additional tax of 10% on goods imported into the United States. This is a better solution for international trade than direct controls on the amount of imports. This import tax is a temporary action. It isn't directed against any other country. It's an action to make certain that American products will not be at a disadvantage because of unfair exchange rates. When the unfair treatment is ended, the import tax will end as well.
Classical economies were initiated under the gold standard. Current accounts were linked to the nation's money supply, and that was linked to domestic price levels. At the time, gold could be imported and exported between nations, and often was, as a payment condition. Some countries would stockpile gold as a surplus, as their money supply was directly tied to their current account. Countries in deficit positions would face similar outflows of gold, directly devaluing their currency. Through time, countries have departed from the absolute gold standard by converting to paper money backed by gold, and other adjustments.
So often, in the past 10 years, I have had to prophesy evil. But now, a great weight is lifted from us, a great tension relieved. There's no danger of the exchange falling too far. There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living. The worst I should expect would be a return to the prices of some 2 years ago. But meanwhile, British trade will have received an enormous stimulus, much more than most of us have yet realized. It's a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage, where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
The quantity theory of money stems from classical price adjustment mechanisms. This theory was developed in the 16th century as gold and silver inflows from the Americas into Europe were being minted into coins. This led to a persistent rise in inflation. Economist Henry Thornton, in 1802, determined that more money in the global marketplace is equal to more inflation, and that an increase in money supply does not necessarily mean an increase in economic output. The quantity theory of money states that there is a direct relationship between the quantity of money in an economy and the level of prices of goods and services sold. The classical price adjustment mechanism takes the money supply, average prices in the economy, quantity of all final goods produced, and the velocity of money. As attractive as that last moniker sounds, it refers to the number of times per year the average currency unit is spent on final goods, sometimes also called a multiplier effect. The formula can be used as an identity, such that knowing 3 of the variables will solve for the 4th. According to the quantity theory of money, if the amount of money in an economy doubles, price levels also double, causing inflation. As a result, consumers pay twice as much for the same amount of the good or service. Another way to understand this theory is to recognize, as I have said before, that money is like any other commodity. Increasing the supply of the commodity will decrease its marginal value. Therefore, an increase in money supply causes prices to rise, also known as inflation, as a compensation for the decrease in money's marginal value. Money supply, price level, and current account demonstrated to Hume, our classical economist, that over time, current account equilibrium tends to be achieved automatically, but other economists identified complications with the assumptions as applied to employment levels and price responses within economic conditions in a recession. Classical economists employed the quantity theory of money to explain the price adjustment mechanism's impact on a country's current account. They also recognized the initiation of inflation as it impacted changing prices and output. In today's marketplace, these philosophies have evolved as a result of additional explanations for an adjustment mechanism. The most notable include the effect of interest rates on capital movements and the effect of changing incomes on trade flows. Capital and financial account transactions include all international purchases or sales of assets within the domestic economy. In practice, the greatest share of these exchanges come from financial transactions made by institutional investors. Several factors considered as investment opportunities are explored, but the driving force to attract or repel these funds is comparative interest rates between countries. Earlier, we explored the capital and financial account to recognize the substantial responsiveness it shows to domestic and global interest rates. As competitive interest rates are identified domestically, as compared to other nations, investments in the subject country will increase to initiate a movement along the capital and financial account schedule shown on the diagram. On this chart, the vertical axis displays the nation's surpluses and deficits, while the horizontal axis reflects the interest rates available within the domestic economy. As we zoom into this capital and financial account diagram for the U.S., we follow along the CFA sub-zero schedule to find equilibrium at point A, where the U.S. interest rate is graphed in comparison to other nations, displayed as a value of 0. Meaning there is no difference between rates in the U.S. versus other nations. Assume the U.S. reduces monetary growth, initiating money scarcity. It may come in the form of the U.S. Federal Reserve raising interest rates, as Dr. Janet Yellen has warned over the last many years.
Monetary policy is not on a preset course. We're watching this very closely and stand ready to adjust our policy if it appears that the inflation undershoot will be persistent.
Enough to raise interest rates by 1%. International investors will be attracted by the increase in interest rates on U.S. securities. On our diagram, this initiates a movement along the capital and financial account schedule from point A to B, causing an increase to net financial inflows of $5 billion US. The converse situation would happen if other countries increased their interest rates by 1% over the U.S. rate, initiating movement along the schedule to point C, resulting in a deficit of $5 billion for the U.S. This display gives a tidy picture of interest rates on investments as the only factor of consideration for the nation's surpluses and deficits. In practice, several other factors intermix in the global picture involving capital inflow and outflow. These other factors can initiate a movement of the capital and financial account schedule, not just along it. Take the example of an improved economic situation within the U.S. economy, involving increased disposable income in U.S. households. This leads to increased domestic saving, investments, and higher spending on durable goods like automobiles, appliances, and furniture. With this event witnessed in the U.S., an American automotive company may initiate direct investments in a new manufacturing plant or significantly update an existing one to increase manufacturing in an attempt to capture the anticipated increase in consumer spending. In lockstep, Japanese automotive manufacturers may increase their investments in U.S. subsidiaries, and American manufacturers may decrease their offshore direct investments. This global shift of advantageous economic structuring in the U.S. causes the capital and financial account schedule to shift along the net financial outflow axis to a new level. New comparative interest rate solutions can be found along this adjusted schedule. Understand from this diagram the difference between a movement along the schedule to a new comparable interest rate solution and the change of one of the core assumptions, like changes to domestic disposable consumer income or tax rate adjustments.
The president launching the tax reform or tax cut initiative, there appears usually for you guys to be considerable coordination from Capitol Hill to the White House to the Republican National Committee. Yeah. This time it looks different. Is it?
So if you look what happened in healthcare and what a disaster that was, we've learned our lessons. So instead of the House jumping out ahead of everybody else, like we did in healthcare, the plan was, let's set up a framework. Let's get everybody to agree. The president, the Senate, and the House all agreeing to what this framework should look like. And now we have to fill in, some of the gaps. But everyone agrees to that framework, Lou, which is a great starting point to actually get tax reform done. It's going to be historic.
And the president now says the cap on corporate taxes is 20%. Right. A lot of debate and dissension within small business in this country about whether or not they should be lagging behind and have a 25% pass-through rate. These are important issues, as you well know. How are they going to be resolved?
You know what? I don't know that issue of that 20 to 25% disparity will be resolved. You have a situation where we're dealing, and you know this well, and you report on it, is the Senate rules. And this has to be revenue neutral. And trying to find revenue to lower rates becomes somewhat challenging. And I think we found, the right sweet spot to make this work. And so that's not going to change.
How about doing what the president said? What Gary Cohn implied is that there's going to be significant growth above 3%. So
that's part of it.
So let's suspend the Senate rules and Mitch McConnell's drag on the party and let her rip.
If I was a senator, I would vote to suspend the rules. Or just, you don't even have to blow up the whole filibuster rule. Just change the rules in regard to budget reconciliation and allow this to work. But I think the plan is smart. And what I got to tell you, Democrats have been pretty crafty in saying this is a tax raise for low income and a tax break for the wealthy, because it looks like you're taking the 10% rate and bringing it to 12. Right. And taking a 39% rate and bringing it down to 35. Really, if you're at 10%, it goes to 0. And if you're at 15%, it goes to 10. So contrary to what Gary Cohn said, this is going to be a tax break for all Americans. We're going to simplify the code. You increase the standard deduction from $12,000 to $24,000 a year. It's going to be good for middle-class Americans.
I hope it's good for all Americans, and I hope you guys get it done.
Revisiting our classical economists, we understand they considered mechanisms of international adjustments by emphasizing automatic price changes to promote adjustments in a nation's current account, without factoring in the role of national income adjustments. Economist John Maynard Keynes was the first to recognize this omission as he described the income adjustment mechanism. He targeted automatic changes in income to bring about adjustment in a nation's current account. Keynes identified that worker income within nations with a current account surplus or deficit would reach equilibrium automatically. His postulate identified an auto-correcting mechanism. He demonstrated how countries with a current account surplus simultaneously experience rising incomes and increased imports. The effects of income changes on import levels reverses the disequilibrium in the current account. Keynes identified how one condition feeds on an offsetting condition, which in turn initiates an automatic response, as long as the economy is free to respond. These offsetting effects can easily be tripped up by counteracting forces, like government interventions. In practice, income adjustment mechanisms need modification to account for changes in domestic expenditures and income levels as these conditions are applied to their impacts on trading partner nations. The foreign repercussion effect refers to the situation in which a change in one nation's macroeconomic variables relative to another nation's variables will induce a chain reaction in both nations' economies, a feedback loop of adjusting factors. This can be seen when two large nations initiate trade, and both enter the trading relationship with current account equilibriums. For various reasons, they may witness a rise in income in the first country owing to product exports to the second country, and a fall in income of the second country as they pay for their imported goods. The reduction of incomes in the second country may lead to a decrease in their imports. At the same time, an increase to the first nation's income spurs imports from the second nation. The feedback loop can continue with micro-adjustments through time. Within relatively short order, the discrepancies tend to moderate. This cycle leads to the first nation's incomes decreasing as foreign imports in the second country are replaced by domestically produced goods. The decline of the second country's income will lead to a reduction in its imports, replaced by their domestically produced goods. This mechanism exposes the flip side of the beggar thy neighbor approach we discussed in an earlier chapter. Imposing trade barriers to inflict penalties on your neighbor may inflict them on yourself. I have said it before, and I repeat it again now. The international trade policy I believe in is to create situations where your trading partners are as successful as you are in each exchange of consideration you enact. International trade is not a zero-sum game, where you need to win with each exchange. Global benefits and the benefits you enjoy are best enabled for all partners. That way, they can buy more of your goods as you buy more of theirs. It is all blended together through comparative advantage realities. The income adjustments mechanism has application to several trading situations and can be evaluated in both relative terms and in quantitative impacts. Within the international arena, the effects of this process will be muted as a small nation initiates imports from a large nation, because the cross-trade repercussions will have minor effects on the large nation's income level. John Maynard Keynes spotlighted the attractiveness of the self-adjusting mechanisms through the foreign repercussions effect, and the effect of changes in national income on a nation's current account. Part of the philosophy engaged by purist economists accepts the ebb and flow of economies as incomes rise and fall, employment levels climb and drop, and moderation happens through an automatic adjustment process. It is the nature of things. Government officials may be able to accept these theories as fine and good, but the timescales associated with these inevitable adjustments do not always play out for the re-election cycles of most politicians. Political administrators often seek methods to speed the process along. Sometimes these efforts succeed, and sometimes they cause a different problem. The flow of capital within nations combines incoming and outgoing investments, savings, imports and exports, for combination in the balance of payments, making international adjustment mechanisms. In the 1960s, the monetary approach to the balance of payments was introduced to identify how the balance of payments is affected by discrepancies between the amount of money people hold and the amount of money supplied by the central bank. When domestic demand increases above what the central bank will supply, offshore sources are encumbered. Of critical importance to the understanding of this approach is to comprehend the conceptual migration of how the American population has been transformed from current need providers into two dichotomous groups, one of savers and the other of debitors. Part of the population becomes savers and investors over the past half-century. Where once Americans depended on a predictably low rate of inflation matched by income and expense profiles, the Greatest Depression of the 1930s and 2 world wars changed the game. These consumers began to build nest eggs of savings and investments to prepare for the impending rainy day. As a result, these people save money and invest it for their personal retirement independently of how the government saves or invests money. Sometimes these funds are saved domestically, sometimes offshore, and sometimes under the mattress. Tracking the amount of money held in non-commercial accounts by the government can be difficult. The other part of this crowd, the debtor, became money borrowers in a big way. Some of the funds have been dedicated to the purchase of housing, while some has been destined for automobiles, non-durable and durable goods, vacations, and other expenses, leading to extreme household indebtedness. Much of the time, these loans are carried on credit cards, second mortgages on a home, or frequently refreshed automobile trade-ups. Before the monetary approach was developed, it was understood that movements of the balance of payments happened as a result of changes to the government's current or financial account. The monetary approach stressed that in many situations, balance of payment problems resulted directly from imbalances in the money market, and that policy solutions relying on monetary policy were the most appropriate. Using the monetary approach, it was recognized that a large balance of payments deficit may be the result of excessive domestic credit accumulation. Even though the balance of payments deficit will generally involve both a current account deficit and a positive private financial account balance, it would be misleading to view it as fundamentally due to a fall in relative world demand for domestic goods or assets. There are many realistic cases, however, in which a balance of payments analysis based on the monetary approach is generalized and possibly misleading as a policy guide. Suppose that a temporary fall in foreign demand for domestic products is seen. This causes a fall in the current account and in the balance of payments, but these effects can be counteracted by a temporary expansionary fiscal policy. Because domestic output and thus money demand falls, the monetary approach also predicts that a balance of payments deficit will result from a fall in export demand. It is wrongful thinking for policymakers to conclude that because the balance of payments deficit is associated with a fall in money demand, that a contraction of domestic credit is the best response. Given the responses of the domestic population as savers and borrowers, this would not be a good path to follow. If the central bank were to restrict domestic credit to improve the balance of payments, unemployment would remain high and might even rise. While the monetary approach is an extremely useful analytical tool, it must be applied with caution when seeking solutions to macroeconomic problems. It is most useful for formulating solutions to policy problems that are a direct result of shifts in domestic money demand or supply.
But he did change the way he invested and became a wealthy man. He'd learned lessons about the way economies work that we still struggle with today. That you can never get rid of uncertainty, and that economies are made up of people, not numbers. More than anyone, Keynes wanted economics to be respected as a modern science. But he knew it was never going to be a science you could reduce to a set of equations, iron predictions, because economists were always going to have one extra thing to deal with: human nature.
If you don't know about the future and you're trying to get a fix on what's taking place anywhere in time, you would defer to the crowd. The crowd is moving in a certain direction. They must be right. The crowd's buying. What are they buying? I must buy too. The crowd's selling. I must sell too. And it's very animal. It's very herd.
This idea of herd psychology helped Keynes make sense of the economic bubble that blew up in the years before the great crash of 1929. It can also do a pretty good job explaining our own great financial crash in 2008.
We have taken a slightly different view of adjustments to the balance of payments. Persistent balance of payments disequilibriums tend to have adverse economic consequences, justifying a need for adjustments. We have discussed how balance of payments adjustments can be classified as automatic or discretionary. Under a system of fixed exchange rates, automatic adjustments can occur through variations in prices, interest rates, and incomes. The demand for and supply of money also influence the adjustment process. The foreign repercussions effect refers to a situation in which a change in one nation's macroeconomic variables relative to those of another nation will induce a chain reaction in both nations' economies. The disadvantages of the automatic balance of payments adjustment mechanism were noted in the chapter. Nations must be willing to accept adverse changes in the domestic economy when required for automatic balance of payment adjustments. Policymakers are urged to forego the use of discretionary economic policy to promote domestic equilibrium because of the abundance of unanticipated externalities. Finally, the chapter considers the monetary approach to the balance of payments as an alternative rather than a supplement to traditional adjustment theories. It maintains that, over the long run, payments disequilibriums are rooted in the relationship between the demand for and the supply of money. Adjustment in the balance of payments is viewed as an automatic process by the monetary approach.